Hello. So excited to be here. Even dressed up for you guys, put on a shirt with buttons. So I am a startup lawyer. Um, what that most often means is people come to me and they have an idea and they have no clue what to do next. And my job is to generally keep them within some guardrails, norms, avoid them making mistakes. Because when they make a mistake, they have to pay somebody like me an exorbitant amount of money to fix it. Anybody want to take a guess what my hourly rate is, by the way? How much? 1,370 an hour. Isn't that wild? So, and I'm worth every penny of it because I keep you guys from picking up really big time. So I would love to know you're starting a company. Who else is starting a company? Okay. What's the company? Do you mind if I ask really quickly? Okay. How about you?
We're like a dev tools company, so helping find colleges for big tech companies.
Okay. And the rest of you are aspiring entrepreneurs? Okay, that's good. I have devoted my professional life to people like you. It is crazy. So here's my really quick background. My older son went to CMU, undergrad degree, master's degree. So I am here unselfishly trying to recoup the $350,000 I paid for the kids' education. Okay, I made you guys laugh. That's good. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So this is my favorite presentation that I give, and I have a whole bunch I do on legal issues, which I find to be the most boring thing known to mankind. I do presentations on how to pitch to venture capitalists, but this is an interesting one. So the genesis of this is when I speak to entrepreneurs, when I hold office hours, and I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I originally a New Yorker. I live out in the Bay Area, so I'm in Silicon Valley, the heart of all startups. And I do things at a bunch of different top universities, and the people I meet are so unbelievably smart, and they make the dumbest mistakes I have ever seen in my life. And it's not because they're not intelligent. It is because they are the definition of ignorant. They don't understand the world in which they are operating, right? The other day I said to somebody, if you saw a YouTube video on how to perform surgery, would you perform surgery on yourself? You, the doctor, know the answer is of course not. And yet people are starting companies, they're bringing on founders, they're raising money, and they simply don't understand the terms, the nomenclature. So we're going to talk about math. I was a rhetoric and communication major. I can barely add, but this is vitally important stuff. And the way people mess it up is shocking to me. And so the whole purpose of this is to explain, attempt to demystify terms that you hear. And depending on what stage you're at, you may have heard some of this, you may not have. This is highly complex to me, but we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about how shares are given out to the founders of a company. I don't know if you've heard the words valuation cap and discounts. Has anybody heard those words before? Yeah? Oh, good. Wonderful. Okay. I'm always nervous that I'm going to be speaking and people really are clueless about it. So this is great. Okay, let's try to get into this. So when you form a corporation, and if you guys, did you form an entity yet?
I have an LLC.
Okay, that's a private conversation. Have you formed a company yet? Okay, has anybody? Okay, what are they? Delaware C corporations?
They're based in India and Hong Kong.
Okay, I can't speak to that. Okay, so in the United States, and we're not going to go into the traditional lawyer talk about what state to incorporate in and what kind of a corporation to do, but the basic here is that almost every ultimately venture-backed startup in the United States is incorporated in the state of Delaware. That's a whole separate topic. And they are what are known as C corporations. It is your basic corporation. Google started that way. Cisco, Intel, Apple, Amazon, every one of them started this way. And when they started the company, they file a form in the state of Delaware, and it creates the legal entity. And one of the things you have to do in that document, which is called a certificate of incorporation, is you tell the government how many shares of stock, the company is allowed at that moment in time to issue. And the basic number that every company uses, every other lawyer who does what I do, and when I say does what I do, I mean works with venture capital funds, works with entrepreneurs who become successful. Every single one of those companies starts by authorizing 10 million shares. And all that means is a company can issue 1 share, 2 shares, 9 shares. When it gets to 9,999,999, it has 1 share left. And after it issues that share, it goes and it files another form and it makes more. It is just a drawer that is filled with shares that you can use as you need. Right? It's a stop sign. It is a limit. When you hit the limit, you get more. That number, that 10 million, is never, ever, ever used for any calculations. And we're going to talk about, when I say calculations, what I mean by that. And this number is increased regularly through the life of a company. If you hire 50 people, 100 people, 200 people, you grow to a big company, you will blow through those shares and you will make more and you will use them as needed. Like I said, it is a drawer, it is a reserve, you pull them out as you need them. Okay, this is the starting point of the discussion. What does it mean to own shares of stock in a company? Right? That's an interesting fundamental question for me. So if you and I were to start a company and we agreed to be 50-50, does that work?
Sure.
Okay, somebody buys the company for $1 billion and we're 50-50. What do we get? Billion, 500 million each. Okay, easy. The reason we don't do that is so we're 50-50. You look like such an intelligent young lady. Would you like to join our company? Great. We're going to give you 10%. Does that work? Okay. What's the ownership now? We were 50-50. Now we've brought on somebody at 10%. You want to take a guess? What's the answer? You don't have to answer. No, I'm going to stay at 50. You're going down to 40 and you're at 10. How do you know the answer to that? Right? I don't know. The whole point of it is that if we just agree we're 50-50, we high five each other, we handshake, we give each other a hug, it works. But when we start bringing other people in, how could I prove to you what the ownership is? And if we have ownership of shares, it allows us to calculate a percentage ownership, right? And it's a numerical count that allows us to determine proportional ownership. This is critical information. And what it says down there, I don't know if you can see it, in the absence of debt, that's like a student loan or a car loan, right? If your company borrows money, or preferred stock, which we're only going to touch upon today. And preferred stock is a special kind of stock that investors get when they give your company millions. In the absence of those special things, if we're 50-50, sell the company for $1, we each get 50 cents. Sell the company for $1 billion, we each get 500 million. The percentage ownership is really simple. It tells you what percentage you own, what percentage you get when the company is monetized. Okay. Here's the starting point for where I see people screw up so badly that it is shocking to me. And by the way, this is actually not an exaggeration. I deal with PhDs, faculty members at leading universities, and they get this wrong. And again, it's not because they're not intelligent, it's because they don't know this stuff. And so my job is to attempt to provide this clarity. So remember, I said that there are 10 million shares of stock authorized in most companies. What if I owned 1 share of stock in that company and the other 9,999,999 are sitting in the drawer, not yet used? or 100 or whatever the 3 million number is there. If I'm the only stockholder in the company, I own 100% of that company. So the reason I started doing this is I would meet people and they would tell me they owned 1 million shares of stock. And I would say, how much of the company do you own? And they would tell me they own 10% of their company. It's like, really, if Google buys the company, you only get 10% of that number. Do I get the other 90%? And you see the little light bulb go off. So the absolute number of shares that somebody owns is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the proportionality. Does that make sense so far? Okay. What if you and I each owned 1 share? That's the example that's in the middle of the page. If we each owned 1 share, we would be 50-50. If we each owned 100 or 3,400,000, whatever, we would own 50% of the company, because the mathematics are, it's the number of shares that I own or you own over the total number of shares, right? You can see the formula there. The numerator, the denominator is what's called issued and outstanding. It's out of that 10 million, it's the actual absolute number that people own. This is a fundamental mistake that I see virtually every startup make. Their lawyers, if they're using one, are doing it properly, and they, the founders, are not understanding the math. Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you that if I owned 1 share or 1 million or 5 million or whatever the number is, and I'm the only person, the numerator and the denominator would be the same, and my ownership would be 100%. So for those of you who have started companies or have seen companies, we don't issue 1 share. Right? I could own 1 share and I would own 100% of my company. I could own 10 million shares and I would own 100% of my company. What's the difference? And it's a matter of resolution. And so if I owned 9 shares of stock, I've already convinced you I own 100% of the company, 9 over 9. But the smallest number of shares that I can give out is 1. And that means the smallest percentage of the company I can give is 10%. Right? If I own 9 and I give somebody 1 share, now there's a total of 10. They own 1 out of 10. That's shitty resolution, right? What if you wanted to bring somebody on and give them 1% or 0.5% or 0.03, whatever the number is? You need larger numbers to be able to achieve that little bit of resolution in the share issuance. And so we typically use larger numbers, like 1 million or 2 or 3. And as I've said to you, it doesn't matter. If you and I owned 1 million each or 2 million or 3 million, we are 50-50. Okay, so far so good? Okay, yes?
What's like the stop time and you have to double the amount of shares, like the denominator, then this.
But you're not, that's the whole point. You're not, when you go from 10 million to, let's just say 20 million, the denominator is not going up. The denominator in this case for calculating ownership is only based on the shares out of that 10 or 20 that people actually own. If you don't use those shares, it means nothing. Does that make sense? We can talk after. Yes. What is the consequence of reaching 10 million? There is no consequence. You're out of shares. When I started doing this, people had physical checkbooks. Does anybody own a physical checkbook anymore? Yes. We're showing our age. What's the last, you have a check, what's the last number? Does everybody know what a checkbook is? Right? It's the thing your mom and dad had, and they would write, they'd pay, I don't know what the utility company is here, Pittsburgh Gas and Electric, right? You'd write a check for $90 to pay for your electricity and you'd mail it to the company. What's the last check number in your checkbook?
Like the actual.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Make it up. Come on.
Like how many checks I have?
Yeah.
Oh, like 60.
60. When you get to check number 60, you're done. The account is finished. You go to the bank and you say, I need another checkbook. And they give you one that says 61. And if you use it, great. If you don't use it, it sits there. These shares are just hanging out, available for you to use. And when you use it up, you call somebody like me, and I call a young lawyer who does the actual work. That was a lawyer joke. Okay. and they file a form with the state of Delaware, and now you have more available to use as you need. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll keep going on this. In this proportional ownership that I'm describing, the key consequence of this is at liquidation, and liquidation is the legal word we use when a company gets sold, essentially. That relative ownership, that proportionality, that percentage decides how we split the proceeds. Okay, let's keep going. It's going to start to get fun. So the reason I actually came up with this presentation is because I was visiting Berkeley, met two incredibly intelligent young women with PhDs who told me that they each own 40% of the company. And the minute they said that, without finishing the sentence, I knew that they were clueless about this. And I inquired, and they said, well, we each own 40%, and 20% is reserved for future investors and employees. And my answer was, they don't know what they're talking about. So I ran through, I won't take you through the whole thing, but I ran through a whole, I annoyed the living daylights out of them because they said I had a friend at Google who would buy their company for 100 million. And after 10 minutes of utter frustration on their part, they reiterated that they each own 40%. And I said, so you get 40 million and you get 40 million. Do I get the other 20 million? And the light bulb went off that it doesn't work the way that they thought. You have a question?
I was just laughing at them when you got it.
Got it. Got it. Good, good, good. So it always equals 100%, right? In this particular case, these two PhDs, and this is a true story, they each own 4 million shares, and they were calculating their percentage out of this 10 million mythical number that has no meaning. The reality is together they owned 8 million, and they each owned 4 million over 8 million, and that gave them 50% each. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Sometimes people say yes, and sometimes I get unbelievable blank stares. Okay, so there is one other mathematical concept that you might hear, and that is called calculating ownership on what is known as a fully diluted basis. We could get sidetracked here, but have you all heard of a stock option plan or a stock option pool? Does anybody know what that is? What do you think?
It's when an employee works for a certain amount of time and they can get stocks vested into their name.
Right. For a variety of highly technical legal reasons that we are not going to go into, because this is, I don't believe, a legal presentation. We create a pool of stock that is designed to be given to employees. Anybody have friends who work at Google? They all got stock options, right? You go to work for a startup, go to work, not found one. You go to work for a startup, you get stock options. Again, highly technical legal and tax reasons we do that, not necessary for today. Yes.
Stock options, you're talking about ISOs and NSOs?
Yeah.
Solely NSOs.
But no, all those are. The question was, am I talking about ISOs, which stand for incentive stock options, or NSOs, which stand for non-qualified stock options? Those are just labels. That's like saying blue shirt or red shirt. They're shirts. The characterization of them is completely irrelevant. We take a number of shares, whatever that number is, and we put it in a box, and that box is labeled stock option pool. And you can calculate ownership assuming that those shares exist. So in this example, 40%, 40%. Let's say that they each own 4 million shares, 4 million over 8 million. Each of those founders own 50%. If we had 2 million shares in a stock option pool, we could also calculate their ownership as if those 2 million shares existed and were owned by people, in which case they would each own 4 million out of a total of 10 million. Again, what's the significance of this? The point is, people throw these terms around and they don't understand what they mean. I'm not here for you to become a math whiz. I'm not here for you to walk away with my knowledge. I've been doing this longer than most of you have been alive, right? The point is, I just want to sensitize you to the fact that there are multiple ways to do these things. When my CMU grad son joined his first company, he got an offer letter and it said he was getting 40,000 shares. And he said to me, is that good? And I said to him, well, the whole company is 50,000 shares, it's fabulous. If the whole company is 22 million shares, you're getting a tiny little shitty percentage of this. So I just want you to become sensitized to some of the math around this. All right, another quick point that is worth making that I hear people make mistakes about is if you are the founder of a company and you own, pick a number, million shares, 2 million shares, and you bring somebody else on, you do not give up your shares. So if I started a company and I was going to bring you on as lead engineer, head of marketing, whatever title you fancy, I'm not taking my shares and giving them to you. They're coming out of that reserve that I mentioned, that authorized share reserve. That's the purpose of it. And if I own 2 million shares, I would own 2 million over 2 million. And when I give you or anybody else, when the company gives you shares, that denominator goes up and my ownership goes down. Does that make sense? It's fairly simple math. Okay. All right. So far we have talked about what I think is relatively understandable math among founders. Now we're going to start to, yes.
Question, so can you divvy up the pie on any basis? Let's say you bring somebody else and that's you. You're 50-50 in the pie, doesn't matter what the number is. You say, well, we'll give you 10%.
Never.
Never.
Never. Never. It is, you can, the statement about percentage ownership is a derivative of the actual share count, not vice versa. So there's a actually classic story, another mistake. If you were to start a company and hire somebody and say, I'm giving you 5%. 5% of what? 5% of what you own, 5% of the 10 million, 5% of the number that you own plus the option pool. What are you taking the 5% of? It is this lack of precision that is part of what I'm trying to address that founders just don't get because nobody has had this kind of a chat with them. Yes.
Because I've heard the term like 5% equity. Is that coming from revenue then? It's not.
It has nothing to do with revenue whatsoever. It is all based on the starting point of a company is I own 1 million shares or 2 million, whatever it is, or you and I start a company and we each own 2 million shares, right? If we were each 2 million, have I convinced you that we're both 50-50? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Everything else that happens is based upon that. If we bring our good friend, the doctor, on and give him 1 million shares, you went from owning 2 million out of a combined 4 million to owning 2 million out of a combined 5 million. The only way to do any of these calculations is to look at exact share numbers. Percentage means nothing without calculating the percentage based on actual numbers. Yes.
So check my understanding. So instead of us splitting it out of the currently existing 1 out of 1, 40 out of 40, whatever, what we're doing is increasing the denominator to the point that the whatever percentage we want to give them, whether 5 or 10.
Exactly. Exactly. If I owned 1 million shares, let's use one quick example, and then if we don't keep going, we'll never get through the thing. We may not get through it anyway. If I owned 1 million, here's a bonus point. If I owned 1 million shares of stock and I'm the only stockholder, have I convinced you I own 100% of the company? Good. I would like to give you half. I would like you to own 50% of my company with me. How many shares do I have to give this young lady? Great. You now understand the math because it would go from 1 million over 1 million, 100%. You would now own 1 million. The total would be 2. I would own 1 million over 2 million. You would own 1 million over 2 million. Beautiful. Can I keep going? I'm around, although I have a flight later, I'm around later. I can answer as many questions as you want. And for anybody that wants to know, I actually do this for a living. My clients call me up all day long, paying me. I don't usually charge for this, paying me to ask these kinds of questions. They are uncertain about it, which is fine. I can't do engineering. I can't do medicine. So, all right. We're going to start getting a whole lot more complicated here. but I'm going to attempt to keep some themes together. So when your companies go to raise money, and I'm not talking about going to venture capital funds, I'm talking about 25,000, 50,000, 100, 200,000. If you have a rich aunt or uncle and they want to give you $500,000, you are not selling them stock in your company. Not yet. You are using one of two very sophisticated legal instruments. Can you see? Okay, good. The first one is a thing called a convertible note. Has anybody heard of a convertible note before? Yes, this is great. All right. So a convertible note is a loan, right? When I invest in, occasionally I invest in my clients. And if I invest using a convertible note, I will write them a check for $25,000. Does anybody have student debt? Yeah, okay. Do you have to pay it back? No. You still have student debt?
Oh, how many spread? Yeah.
No, I was talking to Namrata in the back. I love it. I love it. Do you have to pay your student loan back? You do. Okay. When I give an investment into a company and I get a convertible note, the company owes me that money back, technically. Just like your student loan, there's a principal amount, $20,000 or $25,000. There's an interest rate. The government requires the company to accrue interest. It's a tax law requirement. There's a maturity date, the date that the company has to pay me that money plus the interest back. But that's not the design, right? So what if when your company is fully blown, you want it to be $1 billion company, right? Sure. If I give you $25,000 later, I don't want you to give me $25,000 back plus 4% interest. That sucks. That's a shitty investment. I want to own shares of stock in the company. Anybody want to take a guess? Why do I want to own shares of stock in the company? What were we just talking about? Right, but I have upside because that share ownership gives me a percentage ownership, and that percentage ownership entitles me to that percentage of the value of the company at the end. So ultimately, I want shares. And so we do this thing called a convertible note as an interim means for me to get you money. I don't get shares, but I get shares at a later date when a fancy, sophisticated venture capitalist comes in, pays you a couple of $1 million and buys shares of stock in your company. And there's a purpose to all of this. Has anybody heard of the other instrument we use is called a safe? Has anybody heard of a safe? Does anybody know what that is? What do you think it is?
I assume that it was similar to a convertible note, except for the fact that there's no interest accrual, and I can't.
I love it. You need to come to all my talks. Okay. So a safe is called, well, it's an acronym for a simple agreement for future equity. And it's incredibly simple. I give you $25,000 and you agree to give me shares in the future. Well, how do we figure that out? I'm going to apply, or you're going to apply my $25,000 in the future towards the purchase of stock. So why do we do this, right? So there's some other things up here that we'll talk about in a minute though. So why do we do this? If I wanted to if I wanted to buy shares of stock in your company, it becomes complex. Let's look at what this says. I would like to give somebody here $1 million in investment. Anybody want to take my, well, you're the only two with a company. Would you like to take my $1 million investment?
Well, depends on what you get into, right?
Well, so the question really becomes how much, so first of all, it doesn't work unless you say, yes, you would like my $1 million and my wallet's in the back, so I can't pull it out. Okay. How many shares of stock do I get for my $1 million? Right? This is what all of this is leading up to. This entire discussion actually has to do with this notion of valuation, right? In order for me to know or you to know how many shares of stock I am going to get, you have to know some things. And when your parents want to give you 25,000, or your roommate or your uncle or your aunt or your friend, you don't want to go through this whole process, right? This whole process of figuring out how many shares. It's just really easy to download or call your lawyer. We can talk about that one too, and get one of these forms. What's the form? A safe or a convertible note. And it kicks into the future. It delays these complex considerations until a future date when a venture capitalist wants to give you a couple of $1 million. Okay. You don't want to have your friends or family do these calculations, set a value for your company. It's cumbersome. They're amateurs at it. Okay. The shorter version of this is that selling these safes or convertible notes to an investor is really quick and easy. When I do a venture capital financing, companies spend $75,000 in legal fees, all of them, right? When my competitors do it, we all charge similar amounts of money because it's complicated. And I'll show you what the documentation is in a minute. This is an incredibly fast, cheap, easy way to get some money into the company. And in that next venture capital round, when the investor buys shares, the people who have given you money and own a safer convertible note, they get shares as well. And we're going to talk about how they get shares in a couple of slides. So I'm going to skip over this for a moment because it's complicated. Okay. So just to digress for a moment, I mentioned venture capital, right? Does anybody know what preferred stock is?
Stock that,
You learned this in accounting. I love it.
Partner has like, first, like, I guess, take at the, once a company is sold, those investors will get like first. take
Beautiful.
all of the
Right.
benefits.
Exactly. What you're describing is called the liquidation preference. And all that means is if I give you $1 million and you give me shares of preferred stock when you sell the company, I get my $1 million back before you, the founders, see a penny. There's an entire part 2 to this presentation where I go over all of the mechanics on preferred stock. I will not go into that today because you will glaze over and fall asleep. But it is a complex type of share, and it has financial elements, it has contractual elements. I won't go through them, but you can see the kinds of things that investors who get preferred stock get. Using these safes, using these convertible notes, you avoid negotiating and documenting all of this complexity until a future date when a venture capital fund makes you do this. And my very short version of this is, if you were lucky enough to have millions of dollars to give a company, would you just give it to the company and say, hey, best of luck, let me know how it turns out? And the answer is, of course not. You would want to have the right to know what's happening, to sit on board meetings. You would negotiate for some value for your couple of $1 million. These safes, these convertible notes are an interim shortcut before you get to do this. The documentation on a preferred stock financing, the reason lawyers charge so much money is there are 5 very, very complicated agreements. And again, if I get the privilege of giving you part 2, we can go over that. Okay. So let's get into, and I'm almost up to, all of this was prepped for me to get to 3 or 4 slides where the meat of this is. And hopefully I have not bored you so far. Okay. How do you know how many shares an investor gets? My wallet's in the back. I love to do this. I like to eat cookies, right? Take a look at me. I love cookies. And if I have $1 in my pocket, you find that funny. I love it. Well, it's true. If I want to buy a cookie and I go to the store and I have $1 in my pocket, how many cookies do I get to buy? What do you need to know? Price of a cookie, exactly. Bless you. This is not really complicated. It just doesn't get talked about very much. So the only way to know how many shares of stock I am going to get in your company is to know the price of a share of stock. How do you know the price of a share of stock in your company? Do you just make it up? Do you just say $3, $4, $1.50? How do you know? And the price, there's a means to this. The price of your share of stock is another simple mathematical calculation. And it is determined by dividing the valuation of your company, we'll come to that in a second, by the capitalization. Does anybody know what the word capitalization means? See, I ask a question, I get to take a sip of tea. What does capitalization mean? It's the ownership structure, right? All the stuff we talked about a little too long, probably at the beginning, about if we own a share each or 1 million shares or 3 million, that gives me a number, right? If 3 of us own 1 million shares each, the capitalization is 3 million. If 3 of us own 3 million shares each, the capitalization is 9 million. And we divide the valuation of a company by the number of shares that people own, and it gives us a price. Here's my first complex tie-in. I have convinced you at the beginning, I hope, that if you are the only person who owns shares of stock in your company and you own 1 share, I've convinced you, I hope, that you own 100% of the company, correct? Okay. What if I told you that the company is worth $1? How much is your share worth? $1. Doesn't that make sense? I own 1 share of stock. I own 100% of the company. If the company's worth $1, my share of stock has to be worth $1. What if it's the same situation, but I tell you that the company is worth $1 million? What's my 1 share of stock that represents 100% of the company? What's my 1 share of stock worth? $1 million. It's really easy. And this works for Google. This works for Apple. This works for every single venture bridge company. You take whatever the valuation is and you divide it by the number of shares. And that gives you the price per share, right? At the bottom, what if the valuation of the company is $10 million and there are 10 million shares outstanding? Outstanding means issued and owned by people. We can have 4 founders that each own 2,500,000 shares each. We can have 10 people that own 1 million shares each. The bottom line is, at that given moment in time, people own 10 million actual shares. If I say the company is worth $10 million, what's the price of each share? $1. Good, you guys are all getting really good at this. Okay, this is my favorite slide. So I'm also really blessed. I'm an adjunct faculty member in the Integrated Innovation Institute, and I teach a class on startups out at Moffett Field. And very quickly in each class, I use the example of you've raised money at $1 a share, and you've raised money at $2 a share. Who has done better? Depends on
How many shares there are?
exactly. Most of the time when I ask this question, the answer is obviously the person who sold stock for $2, because they sold stock for twice as much as the person who sold it for $1. Let's work through a bunch of the math, right? And it's impossible to tell without knowing the valuation and the capitalization. Okay, this is where it becomes interesting. So let's see if I can do this and not confuse you. So before we do this, what is valuation? What's your company worth?
$1 billion.
What's your company worth realistically?
I have no idea.
I would like to give you money. We're going to engage in a negotiation, in a negotiation, and I will show you how that works. You think the company's worth $10 million. I think it's worth $5 million. Whatever it is, it's not real. Your company's not worth that amount of money. All we are doing is agreeing on a number that provides the basis for calculating the value of a share, because if we don't do that, I can't buy shares of stock in your company. I can't give you $1 million and get stock until we figure out the price. and we can't figure out the price until we agree on a valuation. It is random, it is arbitrary. Would you like to see my sophisticated venture capital joke? You know how they set the price of a company, the valuation of a company? So here's the dartboard, blindfolded over the shoulder throw. There's no mathematics for this, right? It's impossible. Right? What's my shirt worth? What's my, bottle of water? There's no fixed value. It's impossible. This is all just a made up, negotiated, agreed upon value that serves as the basis for figuring out the price of a share of stock. So let's look at two companies, company A and company B. Right? They are both worth $10 million. I'll do it better. They both have two Carnegie Mellon PhD founders in electrical engineering and whatever, something I don't understand. They're identical. The codes look alike. The websites look alike. The markets look alike. The revenue, the customers, they're virtually identical companies. And we have all agreed they're both worth $10 million. One company, company A, has 10 million shares. What does that mean? 4 founders own 10 million shares, or 2 founders own 5 million shares each. 10 million shares are owned. We just did this a moment ago. The price is $1 a share. If I invest $1 million in this company, at $1 a share for $1 million, I get 1 million shares. Now the total is 11 million shares. I own 1 million of those. I own 9.1% of the company. Does that make sense? I'm embarrassed to tell you how long it took me to figure this out the first time, right? This is not intuitive to me, just so you know. Now let's look at this other company, company B. Remember, exactly the same. In their example, their founders own a total of 5 million shares. Let's go back to what we started off talking about. In each case, whether the founders own 10 million or 5 million doesn't matter. They collectively own 100% of the company, right? There's no difference between 4 founders owning 2.5 million shares each, adding up to 10 million, or 4 founders owning, if I get this right, 1.25 million shares each, adding up to 5 million. In both cases, each founder owns 25%, and collectively they own 100% of their company. Sound good? Does that work? Okay. If you're not following, now's the time to say, okay, so in that case, the valuation of this company is still $10 million, but in this case, the capitalization is $5 million. The price per share is $2 a share. How many shares does my $1 million investment get me at $2 a share? It's on the board. 500,000 shares. Okay. There were 5 million shares outstanding. My million at $2 a share buys me 500,000. And now the total in company B is 5,500,000. I own 500,000 out of 5,500,000. I own 9.1% of this company as well. There is absolutely no stinking difference in what happens for my $1 million investment. In both cases, I own 9.1%. And the only thing that has happened is by varying this capitalization, I have changed the price per share and changed the number of shares that I buy. But relative to these two companies, I own the same thing. Does that make sense to you? Okay, this is pretty much the most fundamental concept in startup math. Okay, right? Both companies are the same, and the only thing that varies is the absolute number, which is irrelevant. It is only this proportionality that matters. Okay, let's go to a slightly different example, and then we're going to go to the weird part that I think is really interesting. Let's make believe that these two companies now have 10 million shares. They're in fact identical. But the two companies are different in their business, right? Company A has a valuation of $10 million. And we just went through it. $10 million valuation, 10 million shares, $1 a share. An investor buys 1 million shares at $1 each. and owns 9.1%. What happens if we lower the valuation of the company? That's the question, right? The structure is the same. There are 10 million shares, but now I have halved the valuation of the company. Doesn't it make sense to you intuitively that if I put $1 million into a less valuable company, I'm owning more of it? Well, here's the math that goes into it, right? So the math now is the valuation is $5 million. The capitalization is the same 10 million, and the price drops to 50 cents a share. We just did this a slide or two ago. At 50 cents a share, my $1 million buys me 2 million shares. And based on this capitalization, I now buy 16.7% from my $1 million investment. All this is designed, and by the way, we can make this available. Shockingly for me, I am told that hearing this 2 or 3 times, it sinks in. I apologize if it's dense, but these are the fundamentals. So I didn't even tell you a word, right? My law firm is Pillsbury. We are 700 lawyers. We must do, I don't know, 300 venture capital financings, 200 venture capital financings a year. Every single time we prepare complex spreadsheets that do all of these calculations. Why? Because it's critical. If you give the investor 10%, it's not as good as if you gave the investor only 9.9%. So we're very precise about calculating values and shares and getting these numbers unbelievably precisely to give the investor the correct percentage that they want to own. The point is, and I don't know if you can see it at the bottom, companies negotiate for a higher valuation because relative to the capitalization of the company, if I increase the valuation, I increase the share price. And if I increase the share price, the investment dollar buys fewer shares, and fewer shares is a lesser percentage of the company. When I invest, I want the valuation low. It's like going to the store. Let's see how excited I'm going to get. And cookies are on sale for 25 cents each. I get 4, right? If I go there and the cookies are $2 a piece, I get half a cookie. That's not so good. Varying the valuation or varying the capitalization of a company affects the share price. That's what all of this was leading up to. All right. Right. Probably, how am I doing on time? Okay, I may make it. All of this was an attempt to lead up to how these safes and convertible notes work. And the reason I wanted to put it together like this is I don't think that most founders have a clue how their safes or their convertible notes work. Again, there's a million stories that I will not bore you with. When I invest and your company issues me a safe or a convertible note, it has one or both of 2 very unique features. It either has a valuation cap and or a discount. And I want to show you how those work. Have you guys heard about this before? Have you heard about somebody saying that they have a valuation cap in a financing instrument? You have. Yes? Okay, not a lot of head shakes. You have. Okay. So I encounter founders who tell me, hey, my company is worth $4 million. And I say, really? How'd you get there? Well, that's what's in my safe. And again, the light bulb goes off for me. These people do not understand what that means. The company is not worth $4 million. It merely means that the safe has a cap of $4 million. It means that the investor's price is determined based on that valuation, not the valuation in the venture capital financing. Let me tie this together. This is an interim instrument. I give you money, you give me a convertible note or a safe today. In the future, when you do a venture capital financing, what we just discussed a slide or 2 ago, your venture capital investor is going to negotiate a valuation with you. that valuation is going to form the basis to determine a share price, and that share price is going to determine how many shares of stock they get in your company for their investment dollars. Oh, go ahead. Well, if I keep going, I'm going to keep going. So hold your question. All right. So the venture capitalist negotiates a valuation. They look at your capitalization and they come up with a price, right? If it's $1 a share and they give you $1, they get a share. If they give you $1 million, they get 1 million shares. That's the venture capital investor. I have a safe or a convertible note. How many shares am I going to get? Let's do one other quick digression here. I have given you money a year before the venture capitalist comes in. I don't want to pay the same price as them. I took a big risk. I gave you a crappy little company today money. I want a better deal than the venture capitalist gets. And the way I get the better deal is I either have a valuation cap or I have a discount. Let's take a look at what the valuation cap means. I'm going to try to tie together most everything we've talked about, right? If the valuation is $10 million and there are 10 million shares, we've done this example a few times now, your investor is going to pay $1 a share, and for a $1 million investment, they get 1 million shares. I have a safe or a convertible note, and it has a $5 million valuation cap. And all that means is when you calculate my price per share, right? The venture capitalist is paying $1. I am paying 50 cents if I have a $5 million valuation cap. And for 50 cents, my dollar buys me twice as many shares as the venture capitalist pays for their shares. That is all that this means, right? When people start talking about, oh my God, I have a safe with a $5 million valuation cap, my company is only worth 5 million. That's nonsense. It only means that the price per share for the person who holds that safe is calculated based on a $5 million valuation. Does that make sense? See, I've done this enough now that this seems so intuitive and second nature to me. I don't want to lose you on it. Yes?
So if you're negotiating a stake with someone else, they're gonna want the valuation cap to grow.
Absolutely.
So that their investment will bring them more.
Exactly. Well,
Or
hypothetically, because let's say I have a $5 million valuation cap and your venture capitalist says the company is worth 5 million. Now the prices are identical. I didn't get a better deal. So what do? Most safes and convertible notes also have something in there called a discount. This one's really easy, and I'll just blow through this so that I can get to questions faster. We already did the, $10 million in the venture capital round, $1 a share. I have a 20% discount. All that means is you take the dollar that the investor pays, you multiply it times 0.8, net of the 20% discount, and I pay 80 cents a share. What's the impact of an investor, a venture capital investor, paying $1 and I pay 80 cents? You got it. Fascinating. And somebody had to prove this to me. You don't get 20% more shares, you get 25% more shares. I told you, I was a rhetoric and communication major in college. This math does not come intuitively to me, right? If you divide 1 by 0.8, you get 1.25. So when you do a venture capital financing, the investor is going to pay whatever it is. Let's use the hypothetical. It's $1 a share. We're going to do 2 calculations. We're going to calculate my price based on my valuation cap. We're going to get a number. And then we're going to do 20% off of what the investor pays. Whichever price is better, that's the price that I get. That is the cost to you for raising money in an incredibly simple, cheap, fast manner at the beginning, right? Legal fees to do a safe, couple of bucks. Legal fees to do a venture capital financing, I told you, 75,000 plus or minus, pick a number, it doesn't matter. Make it 50,000. It's a lot of money. You wouldn't want to pay that much money to take 50,000 from your parents or 50,000 from your Uncle Bob. So you do this incredibly short, simple instrument, and it gives them these two benefits. Some have both, some have one or the other, some have neither. Somebody just gives you money and they convert based upon whatever the future investor pays. So I think, yep. Now we go to the second part. If you want, I'm just going to see if I can preview for you what I passed over. There are actually two kinds of safes. There's a pre-money safe and a post-money safe. Have you guys heard about this at all? Okay, this is actually so shockingly complex, it's not funny, right? I have given this to associates at law firms who look at it and go, I didn't know that. And it's not surprising, it's complicated. So here's the thing that's interesting. You can go to the YC, you've all heard of Y Combinator, right? So some lawyer at YC years ago created this safe instrument, right? You can go to the YC website, because that's what we do, and we download the form and we use it. But I want you to understand what the form is. In the old days, we had this thing called a pre-money safe. I won't go into it. I'm just going to show you really quickly an example of how the post-money safe works. And the post-money safe is what is the de facto default standard today. If I write you a check for, pick a number, $100,000, you are going to give me a post-money safe, right? In this example, let's make believe I write you a check for $1 million. And this post-money safe has a $10 million valuation cap. When you go to calculate the ownership that the venture capitalist is going to get, you're going to do the formulas we talked about. And for me, you are going to substitute $10 million. What this really means is because the 10 million valuation cap is post-money, it is inclusive of my $1 million investment. That means that I get 10% of your company. Here's where I think this is beautiful. Here's where it is complex though. Remember the example I showed you where you vary the price of stock either by varying the valuation or by varying the capitalization, right? Either side of that equation changes the price per share. The same works for these safe conversions. You have to understand what the capitalization of the company is. Let's use the example that 4 of us together own each own 2.5 million and collectively 10 million shares. The capitalization is 10 million shares. But what if I said to you, hey, make it up, calculate my price as if there were 11 million or 12 million shares, as if, made up, make believe. What does that do to the price? Anybody remember? If I increase that denominator, what does it do to the price per share? Because the valuation stays constant. Louder. Lowers it, right? So I now buy more shares. Okay. The whole point of this, and again, this is really complex and I am racing through it at a lightning speed because we're pretty much out of time. This safe, this post-money safe, every time the company issues more shares after my investment. So I give you $1 million and I get this 10 million post-money valuation cap safe. If we were to convert me to ownership today, I would own 10% of your company, 1 million over 10 million essentially. If in the future you issue a safe to another person and another person and another person, that has the result of increasing the capitalization calculation, which means that it increases the denominator, it reduces the share price. Every time you issue more securities in your company, I get a lower price. And so my $1 million today converts into 10% of number of shares. Tomorrow, more shares. The next day, more shares. And the more shares are designed to keep me at 10%.
like you buy the percentage by default, no matter what.
Beautiful. I'm gonna steal that. I have never thought to say it like that. That's wonderful. Yes, in the post-money safe, you are locking in the fact that I get 10%. So I will tell you a very, very quick story. I represented a Silicon Valley venture capital firm because they had invested in a company, and the founder of this company sold so many safes that they gave up 90-something% of the company to the safe holders. So bless you, hypothetically, the founder, let's just make believe he or she owned 100%. By the time they were done, the people that they raised money from on these safes owned 90%, and they went down to 10%. So these safes are remarkably powerful. Okay, if I can for a minute tie it all together. I wanted to demonstrate to you that the absolute numbers don't matter. It is a mathematical formula, right? Whether you own 1 share or 1 million or 1 billion, you can calculate your percentage ownership. This notion of shares and ownership forms the basis to determine the value of a share of stock of your company. And just like cookies, right? The price goes down, you get more. You as the company want the price to be high, investors want the price to be low. Not a big deal. You go to buy a TV when it's on sale, not when it's full price, right? Same thing with shares. These interim instruments have the effect of locking in certain attributes. And the purpose of this was to show you how this magical thing called a valuation cap, less so the discount, which is, I think, more intuitive, right? It's like having a rain check at the supermarket for 20% off eggs. Whatever you want, you go in, whatever it says on the label, you pay 20% less. The valuation cap is completely different. It provides a basis for giving the investor, presumably, a much lower locked-in price. Okay, that is my mad dash through what we do every single day, what all of my competitor law firms who do just thousands of venture capital financings every year, right? I am the most lucky guy in the world, right? I have the privilege, I represent a whole slew of past venture bridge companies. They've all done venture capital financings. All of this factored in each and every time. And my job, when my clients call me and they say, hey, we're going to raise $50,000 or $100,000, is I go through this explanation with them because I want them to understand the impact of saying to somebody, $5 million valuation cap. And the easiest way to think about it is, if an investor is buying based on a $10 million valuation, and I, as a safer convertible note holder, am buying based on a $5 million valuation, doesn't it make sense that I'm getting twice as much per dollar? That's the whole basis of this, but I wanted you to have some insight into the math. Yes.
Whenever the company will go for a venture funding, that's a Series A, wouldn't the VC buy out the stakeholders?
Not at all. Why would they?
The VC would be coming in to buy an equity, they'll be buying somebody's shares out, right?
They are buying new shares, remember, right? They are never, well, they could.
Yeah.
Okay.
They've got dibs, like they got dibs on like the 10%, and there's nothing else that can take their dibs.
I have let's use the example of, I have given you $1 million. I wish I could. And it is based on this $10 million valuation. I am going to own the day of your venture capital financing. I get whatever number, X equals 10%. And then you do the venture capital financing, everybody gets reduced because somebody buys new shares. Remember what I said. You, the founders, oh, give me 1 second, please. You, the founders, are not selling your own shares. I don't want to sell my shares to the venture capitalist. I'm hoping you create $1 billion company. Why would I want to sell out when it's worth 10 million? Right? Okay, you had a question. Yes, please. Beautiful question. Do I have a discount also or not? I do not. I pay the 5 million. I got a better deal than I anticipated. Exactly. Well, I don't know if that sounds right to me, but again, you have to do the very, very specific math, and believe it or not, it's a little bit complicated. So it might not work out to, the exact decimal point, but yes, conceptually, I am getting twice as many shares, right? That's why typically you would get this valuation cap and the discount, which means if the discount doesn't come into, the valuation cap doesn't come into play, I still get a better deal than the venture capital investor. Historically, 95% of the safes and convertible notes I have done have both for that reason.
What if the company never goes for a raise? Is there a time constraint on the same?
Okay.
Like, would they go 10 years on revenue?
Do you know any companies that have done that?
No, but
Me neither. It doesn't happen. I'm sure there are here or there, but there is not a company that I can think of that is making enough money that they don't raise money and do this. Okay, so let's model this out. I have given you $1 million and you don't need to raise money. The legal wording says on a venture capital financing, I get shares. What if you never do them? I'm going to call you up and I'm going to say, hey, listen, I gave you $1 million. The only reason you have revenue, because I gave you money at the beginning. Let's negotiate something and you give me shares. I'm not the bad guy if I'm the investor, and you're not the bad guy if you're the company, right? I'll share my philosophy as a startup lawyer. It's collaborative, right? The people who give you money are good people. Hopefully that is true. But the whole idea is it's a collaboration. If it turns out in 5 years, you call me and you say, hey, Matt, we're never going to raise venture capital. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And I'm going to say, great, give me some percentage ownership in the company. And we would voluntarily figure it out and make it happen. Not an unreasonable thing. And you would not object because I gave you $1 million when you couldn't afford to, buy a laptop for your employee. Any other question? Did this make sense? It's really, there's a lot in here. I don't know how, a question over there. Give me one sec. I don't know how to make it simpler because this is the reality of it, right? Yes, sir.
What if the company needs to get dissolved? What happens to the states?
I lose my money. So the reality is, do you have money in the bank?
Assets, let's just say you can sell it and the whole thing.
I'm going to get my money back before you will. That is clear. But that really doesn't happen, right? Companies either go or they don't go, right? And if they don't go, I lose my investment. But that's the risk of investing in an early stage company. Does that make sense?
Partially answer my question. So let's just say you gave me $1 million. I bought like an asset for $1 million. It's not depreciating or something. Now to close the company so I can sell the asset.
Right. I'm getting that money before you get in it. I'm going to get it. Yes. The safe is a priority ahead of you. But by the way, there's a lesson here, believe it or not. And I don't come to sell legal services. You would be insane to do this stuff on your own without a lawyer like me. And what that means is somebody who is fluent in this and who does it day in and day out. There are a million tricks and tips and consequences that you just can't figure out. I have so many clients that they start off doing things on their own and they mess this up. What is this? It's every part of what we've talked about. They issue the wrong number of shares. They bring in somebody and they take their own shares and they give it to them. All right. Any other questions for me? And thanks for, yeah.
So
What's what?
what determines equity financing happens?
It is the first time that the company raises money from an investor and issues shares, and it will typically be preferred shares.
So it's when they go public?
No, not at all. Not at all. It is when your company sells shares to an investor. Shares, remember?
Yeah.
I have bought this safe, which is not shares, or a convertible note, which is not shares. And by its term, by its terms, it says when you sell shares to an investor, I piggyback on that. Okay, it's a lot. It's a lot. I would encourage you to read the presentation. It'll make a whole lot more sense the second time through. How's that? Yes.
Are there any ways to raise money that aren't, that don't require you to share your ownership?
Are there any ways to, yeah, of course, debt, right? The bank gives you a loan and you have to pay the bank back. Bank's not giving you a loan in an early stage company, right? Doesn't happen. Yes.
What's a way to structure equity such that if I provide preferred shares, I don't lose control of the company with like future dilutions? Right?
Okay. That is part two, and you never lose. You never really lose control, but you also never really have it. So look, here's the very short version. I'm going to give you $1 million and you're going to give me preferred stock. I'm going to put controls on the company, right? I am only going to own 10% of your company, but there are going to be a whole range of things that you want to do that despite my having a minority 10% ownership, you can't do it unless I agree.
Like sell.
Exactly. Or raise other money. I put controls and limits. Why? Because I've just given you $1 million. Right? It's what I said at the beginning. I don't give you $1 million or 5 or 10 and say, hey, best of luck. Let me know how it turns out. I am involved and I have some limitations, right? So what's your company going to do?
On cost, like a automated competitor.
Beautiful. If you decide that the market is difficult and you're now going to make refillable water bottles, I'm not going to let you do that unless I agree. Why? Because I gave you money based on the other business model. Okay. Yes, I love it. I love questions. This is my life.
So CMU as a contractor, if you like use financial resources from CMU, like as a graduate student, you're doing research, they have 5% equity. So does that, what does that mean? Is 5% equity ownership, and does it stay with you, or does it deflate as you?
You're bringing back nightmares of the last licensing deal I negotiated with Carnegie Mellon. So let's make believe that I am the university. You are using my facilities and you have created something, and you now need to obtain the rights to that. In exchange, I get 5% in your company. All that means is that at some moment in time, we figure out what number of shares equals 5%. Again, 5% of what? Based upon what you own, based upon what you own plus the reserve for your option pool. There, right? It's 5% of what is a question. And then there's a question of, well, I get 5%, the university gets 5% today. Do they get diluted tomorrow? Well, the answer is they do not. The university typically maintains its 5% ownership through some quantity of financing. Oh, I'm so tempted to tell the last CMU license I did where if you, I'll do it. This is being recorded. This is a bad idea, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Alex, I'm going to get in trouble here. So the CMU license as worded did not meet my standards. And it is confusing as to how long the university gets to maintain its X% ownership. And the licensing officer we had when I asked that question gave me an answer about how long that 5% is maintained that I did not think was the right answer. And after we went through misery and we got the head of the licensing or tech transfer office, she admitted that my interpretation was correct and that 5% is maintained up in this particular case, up until the moment the company raised $2 million. So remember, you raise money, you sell shares, the denominator increases. You increase the denominator, my fixed ownership now represents a smaller piece, right? If I own 1 million out of 10, I own 10%. If you issue another 10 million shares, I now own 1 million out of 20 million. My percentage has dropped. CMU in this case had the right to maintain 5% as the company raised money. the first $2 million of shares. When it issued the $2 million and first dollar, that dollar now diluted Carnegie Mellon along with everybody else. That's the way this stuff works.
And they kept their equity up until that.
They maintained a number of shares that gave them 5%. So every time, it's not true, it doesn't work like this practically, but every time the company issued more shares, the university was entitled to a few more to keep them at 5%. And then at some magic point, they stopped getting shares and they started dropping below 5%. There's a lot to all of this stuff. And you have to understand how all of these parts fit together. And that's the job of the lawyer. So.
The contract says 10% equity versus 10% share ownership.
I don't know what those words mean, right?
They
The words don't mean anything. Precision is what matters, right? So when I have clients that send out letters to employees, you will get 5% of the company. And I called them up, it's like, 5% of what? I have to, right? If I'm calculating that for you, I am multiplying 0.05 times some number. What number am I using? Because as I've demonstrated, there are a variety of different numbers to use. By the way, anybody wants to do an office hour, which is really 30 minutes. Anybody wants to do an office half hour, just reach out to me and my secretary will help schedule. I hold office hours every week of my life.
Pay your normal rate?
No, it's free. I couldn't pay my normal rate. All right, you want to hear my really funny story? We moved into a new house during the pandemic and I had a bunch of electricians in the house helping me do something. This is absolutely true story. $80 an hour per electrician, 2 electricians. And I watched them slowly walk from my garage to my living room. And all I could think of was, for $160 an hour, you guys should walk faster. And in that instant, I understood how people view lawyers. So, all right, that's all I have. So I hope you enjoyed.